Istilasi I simli il kakayamis. How exquisite is this moonlit night, spilled from the lips of Aylmer Vance. Then he turned and looked at me strangely. We were guests in the same small inn in Surrey, sitting in a cool and beautiful garden filled with pleasant fragrances. Does moonlight affect you? Vance asked. Does a night like this fill you with vague desires? Does your heart yearn with a longing to uncover the secrets of the universe, or perhaps to learn about the future? Yes, I answered slowly, then turned to him. You are deeply engaged in a spiritual phenomenon study, aren't you, Vance? I've heard that you've been researching the ghostly suite for years. Vance nodded. No, he hastily replied. You're mistaken about that, Dexter. You're a lawyer. You don't believe in such things, in ghosts or spirits. You are mistaken here, I retorted. The subject deeply interests me, and tonight is a perfect night for a ghost story. There's a white, enchanting moon in the sky. The trees look eerie from a distance, and the wind is oddly swaying their branches. Aylmer Vance smiled. He was a curious man. Tall, with a pale but remarkably interesting face. His eyes were bright blue with a sharp gaze. His hands were slender and long. His face usually carried a somewhat stern expression, yet it was a non-disturbing sternness. However, his voice created a strange contrast with his style. It was flexible. And I was under the influence of his captivating personality. We first met about 2 months ago at a dinner party. He was introduced to me as a ghost messenger. Ghost hunting was his area of interest. And now, by chance, we found ourselves in the same inn in Surrey. I had come here for fishing, but upon encountering Aylmer Vance, I decided to spend all my time at Magpie Inn. When we met, we got to know each other. We had dinner together at the same round table. Now, we were in the inn's garden to smoke and were trying to deepen our friendship through conversation. Our goal was to establish a genuine friendship between us. However, I had heard that Vance rarely made friends. He was generally a solitary person, self-sufficient in all matters. He owned an old Gregorian house somewhere in Essex, but he didn't stay in England for long. He was a true wanderer, a born traveler, and needless to say, he was a bachelor. If you're truly interested, I can tell you about 3 or 4 strange experiences I've had. During my research on spiritual phenomena, I've encountered a few extraordinary events. While Aylmer Vance spoke, he moved his cigarette away from himself. There was a peculiar expression on his face. I've been on some enchanting journeys. He continued. During these, I've met all sorts of strange people. Faced a few cases of fraud. Met people who identified themselves as mediums. They claimed that there were ghosts in various houses and suggested hunting them. I must admit that I came to believe in it once or twice, but I never saw or heard anything with my own eyes or ears. Vance paused and placed his long, slender hand on my arm. Let's go and sit in the cottage at the end of the garden, and I'll tell you about what happened to my 2 favorite friends 6 years ago. They were Annie Sinclair and her husband. I was deeply affected by the Sinclair tragedy. In fact, the Sinclair case was what sparked my interest in psychic research. It was entirely mysterious, and there were mysterious circumstances that I couldn't even explain to myself. I'm still in the dark about what actually happened. Aylmer Vance emphasized his last words in his tone. His eyes seemed to wander into the distance. Yes, I'll tell you what happened to the Sinclairs, he reiterated. My story will definitively prove that to you. It will also demonstrate how dealing with powers we know very little about can be dangerously unpredictable. Still holding his hand on my shoulder, he directed me towards the cottage section. It was a place just below the garden. I remembered the scent of the trees, the sweet breeze gently blowing in the air, causing the branches of the trees to sway. As we reached the cottage section, we sat down, and I lit a cigarette. The moonlight seemed brighter than usual tonight. The entire garden was illuminated. However, the trees in the distance were barely visible. I felt a bit uneasy. I was still waiting for my friend to start the story, eagerly anticipating listening to him, George Sinclair was my best friend back when we were in Oxford," Vance began. "Our friendship continued after he left Magdalen. And we would occasionally see each other. Then, I went abroad for 2 or 3 years. When I returned to England, George had some big news for me. He was engaged to a Scottish girl named Annie Riddell. I went to Scotland for the wedding. I must confess I was envious of George. After all, I was his best man. Annie looked like a young goddess on the wedding day. She was tall and blonde, with a very lovely face and sweet blue eyes. Her face had a very serene appearance. George, on the other hand, was the opposite. He was quite indifferent. Frail and feeble in appearance. But he was madly in love with her. They both loved each other deeply. The intensity of their love was at the highest level a woman and a man could have for each other. I stayed at their home in Wiltshire for 6 months. During this time, I encountered no displeasure due to my presence there. They were a couple deeply attached to each other. However, I observed that Annie was a bit distant from George. She didn't seem entirely happy. George, on the other hand, seemed to have devoted himself entirely to Annie. He considered her the most beautiful and perfect creature ever created by God. He openly adored her throughout the day, and Annie seemed very pleased with her husband's devotion. If she weren't so beautiful, I might have thought she was a dull woman because she didn't seem to have her own opinions. You didn't feel the need to engage in lengthy conversations with her because watching her, gazing at her for hours, was enough to make you happy. It was like looking at a beautiful painting. You could stare at her for hours with the same delight. Vance paused his speech for a moment, looking directly towards the direction of the trees. Then, with a sudden and swift movement, he turned towards me. Yes, they were extremely happy. They were blissful during the first 3 or 4 years of their marriage. However, their seemingly extraordinary happiness turned into a bit of disappointment when, despite the passage of so much time, it wasn't solidified with the arrival of a baby. The interaction between them was no longer the same. This situation led them to be deeply disappointed. George started delving into various occult researches to find out the reason behind this. He ventured into unconventional methods to overcome this problem. Occult subjects had always fascinated him. He had been excessively curious about such matters since his childhood. Then, one day, George discussed a property with a friend working in the field of archaeology. It was an estate in the Grey Towers area. It was once a place known as the English Cemetery. George, along with this friend, acquired a handcart and started excavations in this area. And his efforts didn't go in vain. After a while, he found 2 heavy gold bracelets. George was extremely excited about this discovery. He theorized that these bracelets belonged to some druid priestesses. And he brought in a medium. This person conducted investigations across the entire area using their own method. Eventually, they declared that these bracelets did not belong to priestesses but to an English princess. She was very beautiful but had become malicious due to an unrequited love and was killed by her lover. George now believed that he too possessed occult powers. And Annie, needless to say, supported her husband in this as someone who was always by his side during visits to mediums. In fact, Annie had never been particularly interested in such matters from the beginning. She got involved in these subjects due to her husband's interest, and as she learned more, her interest gradually increased. However, after a short while, these topics began to frighten her. As a sensitive woman, she began to sense that engaging in occult practices carried a certain danger. Furthermore, as she once told me, the idea of talking to the spirits of dead men and women did not sit well with her at all. Annie began to think that George was gradually becoming more and more peculiar. She felt it increasingly difficult to communicate with him. Eventually, she started believing that a similar power existed within herself. Now, the spirits of the dead were visiting her as well. However, this situation frightened Annie a great deal. After a while, she began to pray intensely to get rid of these experiences. However, this didn't alleviate her distress. Her mental state was deteriorating slowly. Annie began entering a trance every evening. Her husband was not bothered by her undergoing this experience. He seemed unaware that such a situation could have terrible consequences for his wife's health. This situation had taken on an appearance that could negatively affect Annie's entire nervous system. George, fueled by the excitement of discovering the secrets of the otherworldly realms prematurely, seemed oblivious to the situation. The establishment of a connection between the spirit world and our world was the most crucial thing for him. Vance paused in his speech. He lit a cigarette and took a deep breath. I don't blame George too much. He was an explorer delving into unknown worlds and, like other explorers, was daring enough to put himself and those closest to him in danger. He believed Annie's trances were entirely real. I didn't entertain the possibility for a moment that he might have fabricated what he told me. Besides, she wasn't a woman who could say anything she didn't believe in. She wasn't someone who could fabricate anything in any matter. Do you believe these trances were real? I asked. Yes, I did, Vance replied. He leaned forward a bit and furrowed his eyebrows. I had thought his pale face looked like moonlight. Indeed, his face appeared extremely white. His hands were tightly clasped together. It was evident that the story deeply affected him. I was deeply intrigued by Annie's peculiar trances. The spirit of the English princess. The owner of the golden bracelet had spoken to her. She expressed regret for having experienced a passionate love. She wished to be alive again and walk on the earth. She acknowledged her indifferent nature and admitted to tormenting the soul. Her only desire was to rid herself of these and regain material existence. George eventually began to believe that the spirit of the princess had possessed his wife. He thought she was striving to come alive within Annie's body. In fact, the princess wanted to take Annie's place in life. She wanted to speak her language, continue her life, and be like her. All of this coming from Annie's lips was truly shocking. The poor woman, in a trance, was expressing the desires of the princess as if she had lost consciousness. Vance changed his sitting position in his chair. His lips were trembling. His face appeared even paler. It was a situation beyond the typical paleness of a person's face. After the second or third session, they became more aware of the severity of the situation. The deceased woman was speaking with passionate language, expressing her desires without hesitation. She was increasingly taking hold of Annie's soul. She seemed determined to settle into Annie's body and continue her life there. I told him it was best to end these sessions, but he didn't listen to me. George couldn't restrain his interest in the subject and had a tremendous desire to continue the experiments. 2 nights later, she spoke to him, saying she no longer wanted to enter into another trance. After the last session, she had struggled immensely to prevent the princess's spirit from taking over her, and she didn't want to risk being in a similar conflict again. She said, I admit, George, I am very afraid. I have come to believe that the princess can take possession of my body. She wants to live again in my body, and she seems capable of doing so. I can't fully get rid of her even after the trance. When you tell me to wake up, I want to wake up, but it's not that easy. George had laughed at her. He thought Annie was talking nonsense, but he was seriously angered by her desire to stop the sessions. He believed that she needed to continue. In his view, it was absolutely necessary for their research to advance. Annie resisted not doing it for a long time. However, in the end, she was once again convinced to do it. She was the sweetest woman on earth. She had decided to fulfill her husband's request by going into another trance once more. George was very pleased with this, and eventually, he would go into trance once again. Before sitting in the chair, Annie had mentioned that this would be the last time. I don't know whether George believed it or not, but when he called me to Grey Tower, he told me it was his wife's last session and that they urgently needed me to come. He also made a comment that if I didn't come, she might fall under the power of the devil. Alamer Vance suddenly stood up. He looked very frail and exhausted. The Sinclair tragedy seemed like his own tragedy, despite the years that have passed, as if it were today. Reliving these moments makes me feel unwell. Thinking about what happened at Grey Towers exhausts me. As you understand. I heard the rest of the story from George later. Vance walked towards the door of the summer cottage. The pain was evident on his thin face. His hands were still clasped together, and then he separated them. They were sitting one Saturday night. George told me this. I later heard the whole story from him. He had induced Annie into trance once again. Annie was actually very angry and reluctant. Understanding the reason for this wasn't difficult. But her husband had convinced her that it was necessary. She would perform an important connecting role. George insisted that Annie had to wear the heavy bracelets. He believed that on her arms, these heavy bracelets, the princess's past could be more easily relived. Annie sat on a chair in her husband's study. She was a passive instrument in all that was happening. However, just before the session began, she repeated what she had said before. She made it clear and explicit. She emphasized that this was the last time and that she would never participate in another session. All of this had now reached a point that would break her body's resistance. Just before sitting down, she repeated all of this very clearly. She no longer wanted this subject to be brought up in any way. She said it should never be asked of her again. I dare say she might have felt that as she said these things, she might never have the chance to speak again from Annie's mouth. Her bare soul would take possession of Annie's body, despite Annie's struggle. So what happened? I interrupted, curious. Did Mrs. Sinclair have difficulty coming out of the trance? Did her heart withstand it, or did she die that night? I wish it were so, I wish it happened that way, Vance replied bitterly. But worse, much worse, happened to Annie. The demonic spirit of the English princess completely took over Annie's body and refused to leave. When George woke Annie up, the person emerging from the trance was the other woman. This passionate woman looked at the man through Annie's eyes, and he understood that what Annie feared had happened. The new resident who had taken over the Scottish woman's body refused to leave. Can you imagine how terrible the situation was, Dexter? Vance turned to me and placed one hand on my arm. I could feel his fingers trembling. I don't think you believe my story. All of this must sound incredible to you. I myself have difficulty believing it, but George swore to me that Annie's delicate and loving soul never returned to her body again. The English woman never left her body. Annie's face had changed before his eyes, a demonic expression had taken over her. This made the whole scene even more terrifying. The woman he called his wife had begun to love him with a violent passion. It was a fiery, unrestricted love. The warm, burning kisses became unbearable for the man. He could no longer embrace her. He was afraid to eat with her, and he couldn't decide how to behave towards her because he didn't know what she might do. The woman would suddenly start humming and singing to herself. George had sworn that people outside the house seemed to sing in a low murmur. They were singing in low murmurs. It was like a complete nightmare, a horrifying nightmare. That night, before the woman fell asleep, she had held George's hand, as if she would never let him go. And when she woke up at dawn, she started singing to herself. She sang a strange, unheard-of song. She continued to hum her song while brushing her hair. Perfect golden hair had become one of Annie's greatest charms. George used to watch her hair while she slept. But now, those same locks seemed eerie to him. He was now afraid of them. Vance hesitated and then laughed in a strange way. I know what you're thinking. You probably think that Annie Sinclair might have entered a strange mental condition, and all these sessions might have caused damage to her psychological structure. You might be guessing that the situation she got into at her husband's insistence could have caused a deep depressive state in her. You might think that George was also deeply affected by the situation and shaken by this strange state. It makes perfect sense to think about all these in such a situation. These are actually the most reasonable conclusions one can come to. I didn't think that way, I interrupted. I am trying to understand and make sense of the situation. Have you seen Mrs. Sinclair after the session? Yes, I went directly to Grey Towers. I had received an urgent telegram from George, and when I met Annie, it was as if I had met a stranger. She had always been an interesting woman who kept a certain distance from people. But I couldn't find the courage to express this to George. I acted as if nothing was wrong. My God, what else could I do? Annie's beautiful body seemed as if an evil spirit had possessed it. It was a magical and malevolent spirit. Annie's eyes seemed sickly, and I could barely endure her appearance. There was a cruel smile on her lips. She watched George as if a cat watches a mouse, and her hands remained constantly in motion. The woman walked like she was leaping, something Annie had never done. And her clothes hung on her as if in a sloppy manner. Vance sat back in the chair next to me. He was breathing heavily, beads of sweat had accumulated on his forehead. It was a very hot evening for him. "Isn't this horrific, Dexter?" he whispered hoarsely. "Isn't it dreadful?" As you can see, George and I agree that Annie's body was taken over by a female demon. Her sweet, delicate, loving soul had been replaced by a completely different one. The malevolent spirit within her had overtaken her at a worldly level, and this intruder had no intention of leaving. We both knew that her soul was trying to return but couldn't, and we, tragically, realized that this often happens in this world. Evil triumphs over goodness. But from George's perspective, his situation was even worse. The devil could manipulate him as it pleased. My God, what a dreadful situation. I said, almost whispering these words. What I heard from Vance sounded like an unbelievable story, but he told it in an exceptionally convincing manner. I asked him with curiosity, "Go on, Vance, what happened in the end?" In the end, Vance took a deep breath. "Well, it wasn't a pleasant outcome, Dexter." He stood up again. He looked incredibly lively in the moonlight. "I stayed at Grey Towers for about a week. I actually didn't think I could stay even for a day. But the creature that had settled into Annie's body began to reveal its true colors. George's current wife was a barbaric soul, a woman who loved cruelty and lived for cruelty. She had brutally beaten George's dog to death one day, and the only reason was that the dog didn't come to her when she called. Can you understand what that means? She had beaten the dog with a stick until George grabbed her by the wrist to stop her. He dragged the woman into his room, and I don't know what happened between them. But when they returned, the woman's eyes seemed frightened. The next day, she killed a bird. It was Annie's pet canary. She had caught the bird in its cage and deliberately strangled it, and the only reason for all of this was that the bird had annoyed her by singing in a way that displeased her. I was supposed to leave Grey Towers that afternoon, but for George's, and, in fact, Annie's, sake, I thought I had to stay there. Vance crossed his arms and took another deep breath. 2 nights later, according to what I heard from George, the situation was going from bad to worse. The woman was now doing things that were beyond terrible. The servants at Grey Towers had noticed it immediately, and they couldn't make sense of the strange change in their mistress. Then, that night, George decided to perform another trance. His intention was to remove the malevolent spirit within the woman. He informed me of this intention in a letter. However, the problem was that the woman refused to sit for the trance. He added that the woman was becoming increasingly wild and barbaric. A curious atmosphere had developed at Grey Towers. Rumors were circulating about strange sounds heard at night. The entire house was abuzz with whispers and speculations. The day before, there had been a terrible storm, and it seemed as if the storm had exploded directly over Grey Towers. The woman stood by the window, laughing while watching the storm. She had chased away the 2 dogs, and their distant howls could be heard. They were howling incessantly. And George could barely manage to keep only 1 servant in the house. The neighbors had sensed that something unusual was happening there and had cut off communication. Vance paused for a moment. I should have gone directly to Grey Towers, Dexter. I should have helped my poor friend as soon as possible. But I didn't, I couldn't. Instead, I wrote a long letter to George. I wrote that he was a renowned expert in psychic research and could remove the demon from Annie's body without any help. But George couldn't do that. Perhaps he was embarrassed for his story to be heard by others. Perhaps he had hoped to be conquered by the entity himself. What he did was to distance himself and the woman from Grey Towers. He rented a small apartment in Dortmund, and they started living there. Then came a prolonged struggle, a fight that lasted for days and nights. George was making intense efforts to put the woman in a trance. However, the woman refused to let go, and, as you can imagine, Annie's soul still lingered faintly in the background. She was the silent, suffering witness to everything that was happening. They couldn't have any servants in their apartment. A local woman came in the morning to do the cleaning and perform simple tasks like cooking. The summer days were passing in sweltering heat. And George had stopped writing to me. He had immersed himself in the darkness of what was happening. Vance shifted in his chair, covering his face with his hands. I couldn't stand George's silence. I couldn't learn what was happening, so I eventually decided to go to Dartmoor. I wrote a letter to George, informing him of my visit and asking him to arrange a room for me in the village. However, George responded with a telegram, advising me not to come, better not to come. No one can do any good about this anymore. Please leave us alone, so, I left them alone. I left them alone. There was a long silence, a silence I didn't want to break. I could hear the wind blowing and the sounds of branches rustling. The trees seemed to be sighing. I could smell the bitter scent of the trees. The moon suddenly hid behind a cloud, and Aylmer Vance and I were alone in the dark, and I was glad the moon concealed its face. At that moment, I didn't want to look at Vance, and I was sure he didn't want to look at me either. Do you want to hear the end of the story, Dexter? Yes, I do. 2 days after receiving the telegram, I was sitting in the club when I suddenly heard the newspaper boy shouting in the street. He was yelling at the top of his lungs in that East London accent, "Dreadful murder in Dartmoor, dreadful murder in Dartmoor." And I understood what had happened. I went out immediately and bought a newspaper, starting to read the news. Mr. George Sinclair had rented a small flat in Dartmoor and had murdered his wife the night before. He had stabbed his knife into the woman's heart and then shot himself. The romantic aspect of the murder was that after killing his victim, the killer had moved the woman's lifeless body to their bedroom and dressed her in a white satin gown. He had meticulously combed her golden hair and lit candles around her. Then he had gone to the garden, picking almost every flower and spreading them in a large cluster next to the corpse. There was no sign of anger that would indicate he had committed a murder. The newspapers were presenting this intriguing situation to their readers. No one knew the real reason behind the murder, and they couldn't understand why a man who had shown such love to his wife would commit such a crime. If I kept my mouth shut, no one would learn the inside story of this incident. However, I didn't keep this secret. They were buried on the same day. The jury naturally ruled it as a momentary insanity. If only they could sleep together in the same graveyard. But there were regulations preventing it. The murderer and the victim couldn't rest together. According to the public, George Sinclair had lost his mind on a very hot summer day and killed his wife. The display of affection he showed towards her did not change this situation. Vance paused in his narrative, then let out a peculiar, joyless laugh. He once again covered his eyes with his hands. What I'm telling you seems unbelievable, doesn't it, Dexter? It's not easy to digest. I don't expect you to believe these things. George Sinclair and I became victims of a terrible misconception. Sitting for the séance had a negative impact on Annie's character. Her nerves were severely strained, and she began to experience fits of hysteria. After a while, she started believing that the devil had possessed her. But this tragedy is not just about her, it's a dreadful tragedy for everyone, isn't it? The most terrifying tragedy I've ever heard, I reiterated. The moon had reappeared, and I looked into Aylmer Vance's eyes as they met mine. I reached out and placed my hand on his arm. You believe, don't you? He whispered in a hoarse tone. You believe that the soul of the dead woman, the Englishwoman, has possessed Annie Sinclair's body, don't you? You feel what I feel. George did the right thing by killing the woman he believed had taken over Annie Sinclair's world, didn't he? I don't know, I can't say anything, Vance replied. But one thing I'm sure of is that if George hadn't convinced Annie to participate in these horrific sessions, they would still be alive today. If they hadn't removed those gold bracelets at the burial site and attempted to establish a connection between the earthly and spiritual realms, none of this would have happened. And Annie knew this, as you pointed out. She was actually smarter than George, but, just because she was sweet and polite, he paused and didn't finish his sentence. At that moment, when I looked into his eyes, I understood that Aylmer Vance was in love with his friend's wife, a woman whose heart and soul belonged to her husband. We exited the summer house. The trees looked darker and more mysterious than usual. I was aware of the countless secrets that nature guarded, secrets reluctantly relinquished by the woman. I tightened my grip on Vance's arm. "Vance," I whispered, "have you ever seen a ghost in your own eyes, a visitor from another world?" "Me?" He chuckled, a strange smile on Vance's face. "I'll tell you about a little ghost I encountered at a meeting tomorrow night. For that, you'll need to stay at the inn for another night and postpone the fishing expedition a bit. Yes, I'll tell you where I met Mrs. Greensleeves. And there's nothing tragic in that story, Dexter. It was just a simple experience, a romantic tale." The second story, The Unluckiness of 13. I live in a remote neighborhood in Brooklyn, in a suburban area. Unfortunately, my working hours are not very convenient, but I have no choice but to do this job. Because in this day and age, I can't get as good a salary in any other job I could find. My working hours were between 3 p.m. and midnight, but unfortunately, I would usually get home around 1 in the morning. Just like every other day, today I am finishing my shift and heading home. Usually, during weekdays at these hours, there would be hardly anyone on our streets. The scene was the same again. Today, due to being very tired at work, I was thinking of reaching home as soon as possible and going to sleep. On the other hand, the negatives that happened to me at work were constantly preoccupying my mind. I had a tough day. Although, lately, almost every day was passing in a similarly difficult way, but surely these days would pass, and eventually, I would find comfort, or at least that's how I consoled myself. Finally, I had reached in front of my house. All I had to do was climb the stairs of the 5-story apartment building that I had to go out every day. It was not just climbing, it was like climbing, as there was no elevator in this old building. Actually, I lived on the 6th floor since the ground floor shop was considered the first floor. But that wasn't the only problem. Due to the intense conflict among the residents of the building, the manager, who could no longer stand it, had suddenly carried out the move he had been contemplating for a long time one night and, while leaving, had the electricity for the entire building cut off without transferring it to anyone. Therefore, the lights in the stairwell of our building were not working. Even the doorbells were not working. Because of this, we had to climb the stairs in the dark. Since the unrest in our building continued, no one volunteered to be the manager. And we had been facing this problem for days. Like other neighbors, I was trying to climb the stairs using the flashlight of my mobile phone, trying to see somewhat ahead, but it was still very difficult, especially when I had items like today in my hands. Climbing the stairs seemed endless. I turned on the flashlight of my mobile phone and entered the building. Weary, I started climbing the stairs one by one. Sometimes, I would forget which floor I was on because I would mix up how many floors I had climbed. All doors on each floor looked similar, and distinguishing one from another in the darkness was even more challenging. Today was no different, all doors were closed, and in complete darkness within the building. I was trying to climb the stairs without making any noise, aiming to reach my warm home as soon as possible. With various thoughts in my mind, I had long forgotten on which floor I was. However, I felt tired as if I had climbed 10 floors. I had already started lamenting to myself about these seemingly endless stairs. Holding on to the handrails, I continued climbing for a while. With each floor I reached, I hoped it would be the last, continuing to climb with that expectation. I lived on the top floor, the last apartment belonged to me. Before I bought this house, it had been vacant for a long time. For some unknown reason, the previous occupants of this house always faced troubles. And because they couldn't explain the reason, they attributed it to the apartment door number being 13, and even the building number being 13. According to the neighborhood residents, the number 13 was an unlucky number, and having both the apartment and building numbers as 13 meant double misfortune. Due to these superstitious beliefs, the numbers were removed from the building and door, and they were never put back. No one had bought this apartment for a long time due to these beliefs. That's why I could afford this house at a very reasonable price. My house was beautiful because a loft had been created from the inside to the attic, making the attic space mine. In fact, I only used the attic as a storage room for old items. I was so tired that I forgot what time it was and felt the need to check my phone's clock. When I looked at the time, it was already 1:30. This meant I had been lingering on the stairs for about 20 minutes. It was quite absurd because, after all, it was impossible not to finish the stairs in 20 minutes, even if it was the 6th floor. I put the items in my hands on the ground and rested for a while. I still couldn't figure out which floor I was on. But I began to suspect that something was wrong. Then I heard a sound. There was a rumbling noise coming from one of the lower floors in the building. Sometimes, stray cats would enter our building, and encountering street cats seeking refuge in the building at night was quite common. However, this sound was definitely not a cat's growl, it resembled the growl of a larger animal. Occasionally, stray dogs would enter our apartment building, albeit rarely. Trying to maintain my composure, I thought it might be a stray dog. I extended the flashlight of my phone downward, eager to see what it was, but the gap between the stairs was so narrow that I couldn't see anything below. Just as I was about to pull the flashlight back, I noticed a pair of eyes looking up at me from below, raised its head between the stairs. The eyes were blood red and stared at me as if piercing through the darkness. Filled with fear, I recoiled. I pressed myself against the door of one of the apartments, but the creature below rapidly started climbing the stairs. It growled while running upwards. In a state of confusion, I began running upstairs, trying to reach my home and get inside as quickly as possible. Despite being out of breath, I continued climbing the stairs, leaping 3 to 5 steps at a time in the darkness. I was exhausted, but I couldn't seem to reach my home. Finally, I stopped to catch my breath and glanced around with my phone. When I heard the growling stop, I took a deep breath, leaned over the stairs, and extended the flashlight downwards again. I saw nothing. Then, I heard the growl again, but this time it was coming from above. Terrified, I looked upward, and once again, I saw those eyes staring at me from the upper stairs. I quickly started banging on the door I was leaning against, hoping a neighbor would open it, providing light to see my surroundings better. Unfortunately, no one opened the door. I turned to the door on the other side, pounding on it several times. When no sound came, and I heard the growling getting closer, I began banging on the door even faster, as if trying to break it down. Sadly, there was no response from this door either. It was incredibly difficult for both neighbors to be absent. I thought of running downstairs to seek refuge with the neighbors on the lower floor. I started running down the stairs rapidly. The growling indicated that something was quickly chasing me from above. When I reached the first door, I started banging on it as if trying to break it down, but there was no response. I started shouting for help, asking if anyone was there, but there was no sound from the apartment building. As a last resort, I thought of going down and getting outside the building, so I began running down quickly. The growling suggested that something was chasing me from above. I lost my balance and began tumbling down the stairs. I dropped my phone and the items in my hand. I rolled so many times that it felt like I was falling down an endless abyss on these stairs. I was in pain all over, utterly shattered, but I couldn't stop, couldn't grab onto anything. Finally, somehow, I came to a stop. As soon as I stopped, the first thing that weirdly came into my hand was my phone. I picked up my cell phone, I reopened the flashlight that had been turned off, and when I looked around, I saw that the door across from me had opened. It was my spouse who opened the door, and upon seeing me lying on the ground, she exclaimed, "What happened?" anxiously, asking if the noise came from me while reaching out to me. But this was impossible because I was falling downwards, and the floor I was on was currently the top floor of the apartment building. Quickly getting up, I entered the apartment and closed the door behind me. When I looked in the mirror at the entrance, I was frightened by my appearance. My hair was standing on end as if electrified, and there were bruises on my face. Seeing my spouse looking at me with fear, I said, "There are dogs in the building, and they chased me, and I fell and rolled," but I couldn't explain the other things I experienced because I couldn't rationalize them. That night, I kept thinking to make sense of what had happened, but I couldn't connect it to anything logical. Tossing and turning in bed, I eventually accepted it as a product of fatigue and stress, considering it a fictional night. Hoping that such a thing wouldn't happen to me again, I could only fall asleep towards dawn. The next day, when I arrived in front of our apartment after work, there was still a lingering unease within me. I had thought that I should take matters into my own hands this time and fix the always open outer door and the issue with the electricity that no one seemed to touch. Of course, my fear from the strange events of the previous day had caused this. Anxiety and stress enveloped my entire being. Taking a deep breath, I said to myself that all of this was nonsense and checked the time on my phone. It was exactly 1:13, and I told myself that I would be inside my home in at most 5 minutes, opening the flashlight of my phone and taking the first step. Then, almost as if running, I started going upstairs rapidly. This time, I made sure not to forget counting the floors aloud to avoid losing track of which floor I was on while ascending. "I've reached the first floor now, the second floor now, this is the third floor," I said to myself as I continued rapidly climbing, not neglecting to count each floor. I reached the top, the fourth floor, while telling myself that this was the last floor, and now, at the fifth floor, I would enter my home. When I said this, I was already struggling to breathe, but I had reached the final floor, the front of my home. Upon seeing my front door, I felt so relieved that I immediately began searching my pockets to take out the key. At the same time, I continued talking to myself, "See, everything was just imagination, I told you, you saw there was nothing, now I'm going to enter the house and sleep peacefully," I said. The auto-suggestions I made to myself seemed to have worked. When I found the key, my hands were trembling less. "Finally!" I exclaimed, taking a deep breath, and with that, I opened the door to enter my home. However, when I was faced not with the inside of my home but with stairs descending endlessly into pitch darkness, my astonishment grew even more. Turning around anxiously, I confirmed that I had reached the top floor of my home, but I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Somehow, whether it was the effect of running up here or fear, my knees had given way in a way I couldn't explain. I knelt at the doorway, closing my eyes and covering my head with my hands, repeating to myself, "My God, what is happening?" Then, I wondered if I might be losing my mind. Yes, this was the only logical explanation for what was currently happening. The stress I had been experiencing lately must have been too much for me, and I must have started hallucinating. Praying for everything to be fixed when I opened my eyes, I lowered my hands and slowly opened my eyes. Checking again with the flashlight. However, it was in vain. In front of me, there were still stairs stretching down endlessly, steep and dark as far as the phone's flashlight could illuminate. When I checked behind me, there were perfectly normal stairs that had brought me here. I was at a crossroads, with two options in front of me. Either I would descend from here, or I would turn around and go down the stairs I came to enter my home. However, even turning around, I was no longer sure if I would encounter something normal. I stood up and, hoping that the side I decided not to step on would be an illusion, closed my eyes and tried to self-hypnotize myself in the way I had done in tough times. I started repeating the words, "As soon as I take a step here, I will realize that this is not real and I will have entered my home." After the third repetition, although not entirely convinced, I took a step forward. Unfortunately, since my foot didn't touch the ground at the regular distance, I lost my balance and was thrown towards those imagined stairs. This time, fortunately, I was lucky enough to grab onto the door frame and not tumble down those steep stairs. But all my luck ended there. Unfortunately, I had realized that the stairs were real in this way. Instead of turning back, I felt compelled to continue forward and descend these stairs. Trying to gather my courage, I began descending. However, in the darkness, the stairs were getting steeper, and the width of the steps was narrowing, making it difficult to take steps. I continued descending in this manner for a while. In the distance, a faint beam of light was visible. As I descended, the light intensified, and the sounds of children started emanating from the source of the light. Looking upward, it was evident that I had been walking for a considerable amount of time, and the beginning of the stairs had long disappeared from view. Straining my ears to listen to the sounds, I could only make out a few faint noises. As I progressed, the sounds increased, transforming into high-pitched laughter, and it became clearer that there were a considerable number of children producing these sounds. Unable to fully comprehend my situation, I continued moving forward silently, with the flashlight of my phone only illuminating what was directly in front of me. Eventually, the stairs ended, and I entered a closed room. The room was quite low, requiring me to walk while bending over. When I reached the source of the light, a small door about a meter tall appeared before me, with the number 13 written in the middle of the door. The light and sounds emanated from behind the door. The light seeping from under and around the door was bright white and quite intense. Instead of opening the door directly, I searched the surroundings for a safer place and found a tiny window a bit further, facing the side where the door opened. Knowing that there was a possibility of being seen and that I needed to be cautious about what I might see, I cautiously reached out to the window. Inside, there was a tiny room, and in the center of the room, children sat in a circle, playing and laughing with a large model. The bright light covered the entire room. In the center of the children was a large model, and they were playing with it, laughing. Assured that they hadn't noticed me, I began to observe the surroundings more comfortably from the window. Inside the room, there were several bunk beds arranged, and besides the beds, right under the window, there was a bed with a woman sleeping on it. The fact that the woman was sleeping under the window increased the likelihood of her seeing me, making me more uneasy. However, upon closer inspection, I noticed that tears were streaming from the woman's closed eyes as she slept. It seemed like she was having a bad dream, and as a result, she was crying in her sleep. When I focused on the children again, I realized there were exactly 13 of them. Perhaps due to my always strong interest and love for children, I was enchanted by their beauty. They all shone like little angels. Then, I directed my attention to the toy they were playing with. The toy resembled a large apartment building model. One of the children approached the model and carefully pulled one of the puzzle-like floors towards himself. They all burst into laughter simultaneously. Then, by reaching over the extending floor, he opened the window of the house from the outside. After that, he pulled the blanket off a toy man lying in bed and placed it on the floor next to the bed, and they started laughing again. However, at that moment, the toy man in the bed moved, got up, and closed the window. Then, he picked up the blanket from the floor, placed it over himself, and lay back down. It was incredible, the toy had moved on its own. However, the children were just laughing and enjoying it. Then another child approached the toy. He put his hand in his pocket and took out the insects he had hidden in a bottle. Then, he released the bugs into his palm and let them inside through an open window on another floor of the model. I was watching in amazement and fascination as the bugs entered a room and began gathering at the head of the bed where the toy man was lying. The toy man in the bed suddenly jumped up and started running around wildly, as if he had gone mad. He threw whatever he could grab at the bugs, but the children were watching and bursting into laughter. Then, another child came and pulled the model from all sides, causing the center to open. There was a tiny cat in the middle of the apartment climbing up the stairs. He, too, put his hand in his pocket and took out a toy dog, placing it near the entrance of the building. The toy dog suddenly came to life, entered the building, and started running upstairs. When the cat heard the dog's sound, it quickly jumped up and began running up the stairs. However, the child grabbed the stairs and changed the direction, putting the dog on one of the upper floors. Then, he took apart the stair level where the cat continued to run without noticing. In other words, the cat was running down, exactly in the direction the dog had come from, but the child picked up the dog and placed it on an upper floor. After that, he dismantled the stair level where the cat was running and attached it to the lower floor. The cat was exhausted from these games. Now, everything became clear. The model apartment that these children were playing with was their actual living space, and the inhabitants inside were not toys but the residents of the building. Just then, one of the children separated from the group and started playing with the electrical outlet on the wall. Soon, flames began to emerge from the socket and engulfed the room. The children started running around in fear, frantically searching for a way out. Everywhere was engulfed in flames. The children approached the sleeping woman to wake her up. They were screaming, but the woman didn't budge from her place. The room was filled with flames, the smoke had thickened, and the children were almost suffocating. Faced with this situation, I immediately headed towards the small door I had seen just a moment ago to save the children. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. The children's cries were piercing my ears. Confused about what to do, I began banging on the door to help them. However, the door wouldn't open. I started kicking the door to break it and get the children out. But the door wouldn't budge. As I continued kicking, the number 1 from the number 13 on the door fell to the ground. When I picked it up and examined it carefully, I thought that this number 1 might be the key to the door. Trying the keyhole, I indeed realized that the number 1 was the key to the door, and the door opened. I entered the room filled with smoke and started calling out to the children to get them out. The children crowded around me, hugging me and crying. I quickly headed towards the door, but unfortunately, there was no door. I went to the window above where the woman lay. While calling out to the woman, unfortunately, apart from the tears in her eyes, there was no movement. I opened the window to get the children out, but this window was not the one I had looked into earlier. The window opened outward, and fire trucks were waiting below. They were shouting for me to jump down. I said, "There are children, I must save them," and began tossing the children I held into the airbag opened by the fire brigade. In the end, all the children were saved, only the woman lying in bed remained, and I wanted to hug her. But just as I leaned towards her, she opened her eyes and hugged me. "I have already died, but you saved my children, thank you," she said and pointed to a model with one hand. Only the top floor of the model was on fire. Then the model suddenly began to disappear, and everything started shaking. To avoid falling, I knelt on the ground and watched as everything slowly disappeared with the tremors. The room, along with its contents, was completely disappearing. What a magnificent sight it was. Finally, the woman who had embraced me in my arms began to disappear, and just as the room was about to vanish, the traces of crying on her face disappeared, replaced by great joy and happiness. By pointing at the last thing with his hand, he vanished on his own. When I turned towards what he had pointed at, there was a box there. As I opened the box, I found a snow-white crystal rose, some money, and a letter inside. When I took the letter in my hand and read it, I realized that the woman was the owner of the letter. In the letter, she talked about her lover, whom she lost on the first day of their marriage in a traffic accident. In their dreams, they had a happy family and children. Therefore, with the thought of whether she could suppress her pain, she had adopted orphan children and devoted herself to them. However, with the hope of reuniting with her unforgettable lover, she had committed suicide that night, and unfortunately, no one survived the fire that occurred that same night except herself. That's why her soul had remained in torment and imprisoned there every night until I came. Just at that moment, my wife had stuck her head out from the opened attic door, looking at me. When she said, "What are you doing in our attic?" I realized that I was in the attic of our house. When I looked at the clock, I saw that it was exactly 1:13. And I said to my wife, "I had a surprise for you, I was going to keep it a secret, adding, "But since you're awake," I handed her the crystal rose, a gift from the deceased woman's lover, and put the letter along with the money in my pocket, then hugged my wife. I couldn't tell her about these events, but I could say something beautiful to her. I hugged her and said, "I love you so, so much," and whispered in her ear, "My dear, shall we have a child?" When I looked at my wife's face, I saw the last moment's happy image of the disappeared woman. Very soon, we'll meet again in new and chilling stories. If you subscribe to my channel and support me by liking my videos, I would be very happy. Stay tuned for the continuation of the stories.